Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Williamsburg City Council work session meeting of Monday, May 10th. Ms. Felica, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Ramsey.
Here.
Mayor Pons.
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent.
Here.
Mr. Maslin.
Here. Good. Well, it is a pleasure to be back in the Stryker building. I guess it's been nearly a year, September? Yeah, so it's been a long time. I almost forgot how to get here. So I'm glad members of the staff and public could be here today. So we have agenda item number 3, items for city council meeting, council preview. Mr. Trivett.
So for council preview, actually, many of them are housekeeping, but the first one has to do with a public hearing for a lease agreement with William & Mary, just sort of renewing something we've done in the past. And then we move into some budget adoption items, including the adoption of the budget, the adoption of the cigarette tax rate. We have a resolution that will adopt some new fiscal policies for us that accompany the budget. Then we have a couple of budget amendments and a parking lease agreement with Colonial Williamsburg to implement the 2016 parking study, at least one of those recommendations. And then appointments to boards and commissions, as well as a resolution recommending appointments to the Board of Equalization.
Thank you. So in that, Mr. Trivett's comments there, we talked about the budget. And I know that during our last meeting, council members, we talked about allowing for May's opportunity in public to allow the public to come share their thoughts with us. They didn't have that opportunity and online, and so giving the public the opportunity to show up in May today and again Thursday potentially leaves us in a position where we could, in fact, vote for the budget on Thursday's meeting rather than holding off till June's meeting. So that's why we see it in the agenda the way we have it today. So with that, I'm going to go into public comments. I do have one speaker's card. Mr. Cranbill, Dr. Cranbill. David, please, if you just state your name for the record. And
201 Harrison Avenue. I usually forget that. Thank you.
welcome.
I'm glad to see all 5 of you. And I'm thrilled that all of the city people are doing well. And my first comments are to really thank the city for how well they functioned. I particularly want to thank Dan for this ongoing project with the Monticello intersection. And I mean, I just think it's fantastic. And I hear there's some rumors about a roundabout still floating around. But for those who have drawn to cities with roundabouts, unless you have roundabout experts in your community, it's a mess. But at any rate, it's a fantastic corner intersection. It has great bike paths, parking, and now he's even working on a crosswalk, which will allow people to go back and forth from the businesses on both sides of the street in the middle of the block there. And it looks just beautiful. The second thing I want to thank is Carolyn Murphy, who's doing, and always has been, doing a superb job, fantastic job in working to implement some of the high priority items from the neighborhood workshop and the neighborhood residents, their concerns. And of course, I was just delighted to see that after it took, I mean, it seemed like impossible, but we now have new ideas for construction items with Aaron Burke working under Carolyn. And so, I mean, it's a very exciting moment in spite of a very, very difficult year. And I'm here to really talk about the tax increase for real estate. You all have my letter, which I carefully thought about, so the words in it are very sincere. Frankly speaking, those of us with homes of $500,000 and more, and some with houses of $1 million valuation, are not paying their fair share of the taxes to support this city. We may be taxed, and maybe even more, from our income at the state and federal level, but we aren't coming even close. The city is subsidizing the wealthy. The lower income people, thanks to our not getting through our initial plan for the revenue to support the tourist fund, We have a 1% sales tax. The lower your income, the higher the percentage of your taxes that you're paying to support the city. That's an absolute fact. So it's time for us to step up to the plate, take a real estate tax that is incredibly low, unbelievably low, for me, embarrassingly low, and start having those of us with very high valued homes, and obviously, in general, or almost inevitably, higher incomes, to pay our fair share of the city's costs. So I just politely but strongly want each of you to be able to feel good on how you vote, and that you're happy to pay a higher real estate tax yourselves, and that you want to convince your neighbors that all who love the city, I'm quite sure that it's time for us folks with $500,000 plus homes to start paying our fair share to support all these terrific ideas that Drew's put forward. And furthermore, I would simply say Drew did a fantastic job of explaining why we need this revenue. So let's just do it, and if we want to reduce taxes, let's worry about reducing the taxes for those who have less ability to pay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So if there's anybody else who would like to come forward and speak to council, now's an opportunity. Seeing no one, we'll close the open forum and move on to background presentations. The first is a presentation regarding the status and survey results of Capital Landing Road project. Mr. Small, welcome.
Mr. Mayor, members of council. 1 second. We're here today to talk about the Capital Landing Road corridor improvements. And what we held over the last month was a virtual stakeholder survey so that we could solicit impact or some responses and get stakeholder input on the proposed project that's been going on out there, or at least it's trying to get started and moving on out there. It was originally intended, this survey was originally intended to be in person. Public information meetings would have occurred mostly during last summer, but that kind of got delayed due to this pandemic that's been going on. Little minor stumble in the road. So what we did is we put together an overall video as well as maps and other information of the whole study area, kind of give an overview of the overall project. Then we requested some demographic type information on, what was your interest in the corridor, and we'll kind of go through each of that. Then we gave a series of 3 example configurations, and we tried to stay away from the term options, because these were not the 3 options that we're choosing among. These were 3 examples where we could just, demonstrate, this is one that shows this particular aspect and this one, but also this other thing. But you could mix and match these, either configuration, to come up with the final project. We then asked 26 questions to determine preferences for what everybody wanted. Did you prefer it? Or did you not prefer it? Or did you just have no preference whatsoever? And those that kind of told us, good, bad, or we just, ambivalent about it. And then we also offered a overall general comment box so that we could solicit just kind of open feedback. And then this whole project was hosted virtually on publicinput.com. Which is very similar to other city surveys that we've done recently, including the fire station. This survey ran for just at a month, from April 7th to May 6th. And that's why you're just getting a lot of the information very recently, because we just put this, it just closed last Thursday. So our overall response was actually quite amazing. I want to kind of explain some of these numbers. We did have almost 1,300 views of the survey, And then that also pares down to 529 participants. And a participant here is someone that provided at least one response to the various questions that were asked in the survey. And we'll kind of go through that in a minute on how that pared down as you went through the survey. 47 of those responses or participants had listed an address within the corridor limits, which is shown in the map to the right on the right-hand side of the slide. We actually received 8,782 responses. And what that means is a response is an actual answer to a question. So one participant could provide approximately, it kind of depends on your interpretation, it was about 30 to 33 questions on the survey, depending on if they provided an additional email address for another stakeholder or not. So if you divide the 8,000 so many responses by the 33 questions, you get around 266 full surveys completed. So that kind of tells you of the 13,000 views, we really only got about 266 full surveys completed. And that actually does correlate to some of the questions I'll explain in a few minutes. And then we also received 151 comments. And these are from all over the place. Now, what I also did is I asked Mr. Barham to kind of pull together, who assisted, he was on our technical side of this, to kind of pull together a separate report for just the participants located within the corridor limits. And so there's a separate kind of statistics for that, as well as the statistics for the overall survey. I'll be presenting the overall survey on the screen, but I'll kind of go through each of the, where there was different for just the corridor responses. These are the kind of the demographic, what we call the demographic questions, and they were related to how often do you use the road, do you use public transportation in the area, and do you walk or ride a bike in this area? And this was not filtered, so this actually had 437 respondents. So of the 13,000 or 1,300 views, we're now down to 437 actually answered a question beyond the 500 that had at least filled in their address on the map. So it's filtering down a little bit. And so what you see here is you actually have a lot of people, 43% of the respondents do use it every day. So they're along the corridor at least once a day. Then you got another large percentage, 32%. So now you have 75% that use it at least once a week. So this is a good, very good response for people that actually do use the road. Then when we look at public transportation, though, almost 95% never use the public transportation along the corridor. That's actually not an uncommon statistic. It's not unexpected, and you'll see this as you look in your water ridership percentages. They're probably very comparable to those, how often the bus gets used. And then also, do you walk or ride a bike in this area? We've got 55% that almost never ride a bike in that area. That may be because, of course, right now there's no bike lanes, but you see there's also a heavy percentage that use a bicycle or walk every day. The other demographic type question, and we're now down to 461 respondents at this point, was how do you, what is your involvement with this project? How do you use the road? Of this, we had 49% that were corridor commuters that drove through the project or along the corridor, but they didn't necessarily stop or were not ownership along the corridor. Then we had 30% that were said they were corridor residents, and I want you to note that number. And then another 27 that were others, 18% that are property owners, and only 4% that are business owners. Now this is of the 467 respondents. Of the 47 in the project limits, it changes significantly. You have 66% that are residents and 60% are owners. And then you had 23% that are commuters and 23% that were business owners. And that, to me, is a much more representative of those within the corridor. And that's what I would expect the percentages to be. The other was just a very small number, 3% or 4%, something like that. So this was kind of good to help filter those within the corridor that are directly impacted versus those that might use the corridor from the outside that are indirectly impacted. So you want to know where the responses came from, and this kind of map kind of shows this overall. We had, as I said, 457 that actually listed an address for us. And so we have a pin on a map that we know where it is. 414 of those were actually in the Hampton Roads area. The rest of them, we had a few from California, from Florida, some from Williamsburg and Brooklyn. So those are always the interesting ones. That also whittles down to 390 just within the Williamsburg area, and that's Williamsburg, James City County, Greater Williamsburg, York County. And then that narrows down to the area that we call the Northeast Triangle, or at least was once known as the Northeast Triangle, between the railroad tracks all the way up to Queens Creek, kind of that whole corridor, including Merrimack Trail and 2nd Street area. That narrows down to about 110 responses. We're all in that area. And then the 47 were in the corridor limits. So about half of them were just outside the corridor limits that were in the very vicinity. And then you've got a lot that are just all over the Williamsburg area and out in the county. You can actually see over on the map, there's actually a whole bunch that are out in the Queens Lake neighborhood, a lot of them just out in York County, some down in Kings Mill, various locations all over the place. A lot from downtown. So the next thing we did after we got all of these demographic questions is we came up with 26 preferences that we were requesting. So our survey was broken down into these 7 major categories. We had 2 questions on the road diet and so on. 9 on specific details on the streetscape, and then 3 on the overall. And really what we were asking, we gave examples. Mostly we tried to use examples from the local area as much as possible, and asked if it was preferred, not preferred, or if they had no preference at all. Our first one was on road diet, and these were the pictures and the illustrations presented. We talked about a road diet to go from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes, as can be seen over on Jamestown Road at one time. And then we have another one where we went from 4 lanes down to a 3-lane section, which has the center dual turn lane. And that is a 2-way left turn lane is what it's called. And this is an example over on 2nd Street, as can be seen in the before and after on 2nd Street. So of those responses, it's pretty clear going from 4 lanes to 2 lane is not preferred by 65% of the respondents. And this is all 257. You notice we're down to about where the average response is, which was once the people saw that there was probably 26 questions, a lot of them dropped out. They probably had gotten to this point in the map and they said, oh, there's 26 more, and so we stopped. But this 257 responses is excellent for a road project. I would normally expect in the 20 to 30 range if we had held a public meeting. And that's actually pretty close to what we had for just the responses within the project corridor. It was around 30 total responses to this question. Within the project limits, the percentages on road diet, it was about going from 4 lanes to 3 was about 89% preferred. with only 7% not preferred. And so you see it was even within the project corridor, they really wanted much higher percentage of going from 4 lanes to 3. So it went from 75 as all of the respondents to 89 for just within the corridor. For on-street parking, these are the 3 illustrations we gave, which are on North Henry Street, Richmond Road near College Corner, and Prince George Street, east of Henry Street. And these were no on-street parking, parallel parking on one side, or parallel parking on both sides. What was their preferences on each of these cases? This is what we ended up with. No on-street parking was a 54% preference for the 267 respondents. Parking on one side was not preferred by 50%. 67% not preferred parking on both sides. So it's pretty clear that it was a very big preference for no parking on-street parking on Capitol Landing Road. It's actually generally more emphatic when we look at those within the project limits. They actually said 59% preferred no parking. And 64% of not preferred on one side. But it's only 60%. It was a little less not in preference when we talked about 2 sides. The next few questions had to do with bicycle accommodations, and these were the 5 types of bicycle accommodations that we presented in the survey. Signed shared roadway, these are actually hardly any of them. Only a few of them are located here in town. They include the overall bike lanes as shown on 2nd Street, the buffered bike lane showing on Monticello Avenue, as well as the shared use path along Monticello Avenue. And so what you see is these are the different types of bike lane accommodations that we could provide along the road. The shared roadway and the wide outside lane were very clearly not preferred at all. And then the bike lane did show a slight preference. 55% preferred it over some of the others. Then when we get, and of the, that was 249 respondents overall. And then of the 29 responses we've got within the project limits, 77% did not prefer the shared. It was 57% versus 60 on the wide. But then it was a 66% preference on the bike lanes. So it was a high preference, fairly high on the bike lanes, difference between that and the overall. The next we had was the buffered bike lanes and the shared use path. Now these showed a greater preference. So as we got, quote, increased up our bike accommodation, we also increased preferences. And so we see here that it was 53% preferred. The buffered bike lane is 60% really preferred the shared use path. Now, this was a big difference between what was within the, for the respondents within the corridor. Only 27% preferred the buffered bike lane, 46% not preferred of the buffered bike lane. And then 46% preferred the shared use path, and 35% did not prefer it. And so that kind of shows a difference between in the corridor and out. Within the corridor, for bicycle accommodations, they wanted regular bike lanes on both sides of the street. But overall, the general public prefers the shared use path. The next thing we looked at was pedestrian accommodations, and these are just sidewalks. And what we looked at was sidewalks located adjacent to the back of curb, as seen here in front of the Copper Fox on Capitol Landing Road, And then we had sidewalks with a buffer strip. And with a buffer strip, you can include tree plantings, benches sometimes, and other amenities. And this is similar to the buffer strip. This is the buffer strip on South Henry Street, just south of Duke of Gloucester Street, across from the ticket office. Here was the preferences. Sidewalk at the back of curb for the overall 257 respondents was 46, did not prefer it. However, the sidewalk with the buffer strip was greatly preferred by most people. So it's pretty obvious which one they wanted. Within the limits, they were a little less extreme on the for and against. They were 29% preferred the back of curb, versus 39 not preferred. And then for the buffer strip, it was 71% preferred to the 10% not preferred. And you, by the way, in your packets, you have the full reports for both separated out, so you'll be able to look at those. The next thing we looked at was transit accommodations. And these were, did you want bus shelters at the bus stops that were along the way? And then the other big one was bus pull-offs. So the buses could exit the travel way while they loaded and unloaded. The example on the left is actually in front of, in James City County, in front of Prime Outlets. And then the bus pull-off there is right near Rita's on Monticello Avenue. So our transit accommodations, we showed 60% preferred the bus shelters, 79% preferred the bus pull-offs. So it was actually a pretty high percentage wanted the bus pull-offs. Again, they were less extreme within the corridor limits. It was a 45 to 24 split for the shelters, 45% preferred. And then for the pull-offs, it was 63% to 15% not preferred in the bus pull-offs. And so they were just a little less. I could see business owners not wanting this big shelter in front of their business blocking their business. And that's not uncommon. Then we went through and looked at all the streetscape details. Very few of these streetscape details were from here in town, so don't go looking for them. But the only one you'll see is at the lower right for the outdoor cafe and plaza area. That is right at the Dog Street Pub on North Henry Street. Duke of Gloucester's right, kind of left to right in front of you. So these were the ones we asked for. We start with the gateway feature at either end, the north and the south end. And you see the overall general public had a 49% preference for the north end gateway feature versus 46% for the south end. So there was it was 50% wanted it. The other half didn't want it or had no preference at all, no real opinion. However, within the project limits, there was 32 responses to this one, and it was 38% preferred the north end versus 19 not preferred, and then with 42% providing no preference. So for the most case, the property owners and the residents out there had no real opinion on the gateway feature. And it was 22% and 37 against, with 42% no preference on the south end. And so it was a little bit different. The gateway feature, to me, it looked like a lot of them were just, okay. They may not have understood what it was or how it impacted. The next thing we looked at were, of course, decorated intersections similar to the stamp asphalt like we just put on Monticello Avenue. Planting beds, tree pits, street lighting, and pedestrian lighting. And of course, a lot of times when you throw up this stuff, the bling that goes on a road project, everybody wants it. So I'm not surprised by the answers. I'm actually kind of surprised some of the things are low as they are. And what you found is that for the people within the corridor, there really wasn't a lot of difference here, just a few percentage points here and there. So I didn't even pull those numbers out. The next thing we have are the street furniture, the scooter parking and bike share stations, and the outdoor cafes and plaza areas. And this is where we did see a little bit of a difference. Street furniture, it actually dropped within the corridor for the 32 responses in the corridor. They said only 48% is preferred. So it was a significant lower on the street furniture. And that was, I'm not sure about that one. And then we had scooter bike share within the corridor was much preferred. It was 42%. It increased by 4 percentage points there, with 27% against. So it went up, kind of up and down a little bit. The outdoor cafe and plaza area, you would expect that might go higher. It actually went lower within the corridor, down to 73%, and 10% against were not preferred, with 17% no preference. The next is the overall streetscape overall. The picture you see for underground wiring above is from 2nd Street before and after that project. And the other last two questions were for the overall aesthetic to the corridor. Is it a colonial aesthetic with the colonial type light fixtures, something to blend in, or is it more modern or traditional aesthetic touches? And so what was the preference of everybody? This is how it ended up under underground wiring. This was the highest number we received as a preference, as a definite, 91%. And believe it or not, it was even higher for the respondents within the corridor. Of the 30 that we got within the corridor, it was at 93%. So it's not really surprising. There was a higher percentage. It was 3% not preferred within the corridor, which was kind of baffling, but there's always one. And then we have the colonial aesthetic touches was 67% preferred, and on the modern, they went 43% not preferred. And so the biggest difference there was on the modern. There really wasn't a lot on the colonial aesthetic, but on the modern within the corridor, it was a 25% preferred to 32 not preferred. And they had a bigger, higher percentage of their no preference. They basically swapped their no preference versus not preferred. So they were just a little more ambivalent about it. The last kind of thing that we asked were the open comment period. We had 151 written comments. So of about the 250 that made it this far, 151 provided written comments. They are anonymously provided. There are a few that actually did list their name or address within the comment, and I'll leave that to you to read. I only provided a few of them up here, and these were scattered as far as their opinions for and against the project. So I just kind of chose randomly. They looked nice on the slide. And I do not know who they provided. Only that data is accessible, but only by the IT department, and they're not telling me. And I don't really want to know. The major themes that we got out of the comments are underground wiring. We definitely want the underground wiring. Some of the themes that were kind of in contrast to the comments were maintaining 4 lanes. A lot of people that wrote in the comments was they wanted to keep the existing lanes as it is. They didn't want to, a lot of it had to, I think, is related to that corridor commuter number being so high for the public at large who want to just keep moving through. And I'm not surprised there. But that's in contrast to the road diet questions, which did say we want this. The next one was, the next major theme was probably no on-street parking. That was pretty common throughout. There was also a bunch of comments about the homeless population in the area. A lot of concerns there. There was concern over the section of Capitol Landing Road and actually Page Street south of the Colonial Parkway. And this kind of dictates, well, I'm on the Capitol Landing Road corridor, so there might be some confusion but they didn't necessarily look at the map to say they're not in the project area. So I'm not surprised by some of that. And then we have a push for a traffic signal at Merrimack Trail. A lot of that is related to backups that happen on I-64 because of the construction right now. And they'll divert, Waze will send you off of down to 143 and around to get around the traffic backup. And so now a lot of residents from Brandywine can't get out of their neighborhood to make the left. And they either have to turn left directly onto Capitol Landing Road, or they come out to 143 where they have to turn left onto Capitol Landing Road. So they don't have a choice there. And so I could see why there's a concern for a traffic signal. And then the last thing that was kind of the major theme was they all wanted to know which restaurants and cafes and parks, and we want a fountain here. It was about the details of what's going to happen with the redevelopment, of which obviously a road project, really, we don't have a lot of control over that. So, but those were kind of the major comments. And that completed our survey. Our next steps on the project, just to kind of give you a heads up, the data collection phase will start next week with topographic survey, our environmental inventory where we go out and survey where the wetlands and all of that stuff. Cultural resources survey. We do have some archaeological resources in the area. Geotechnical exploration of the soils underneath so that we can make sure a road's going to hold up, as well as our subsurface utilities so that we know where they are located. So all that's kind of the engineering details will start next week, and that'll last throughout most of the summer while they're compiling all of that data. We are asking that City Council, we do not need a decision this evening, but we ask that you ponder this and kind of tell us what direction you want us to go with, no on-street parking. How do you want us to proceed at this point? And we'd like to have you talk about that amongst yourselves over the next month or so. And then into June, sometime by the end of June, we'd like to hear something from you. That'll allow us to go to the next stage of completing what's known as the scoping report for VDOT, get that into at August. And then the engineering design will still continue through our federal process, going back and forth with them, and that'll continue through May of 2023. So it's just, that's part of the process and part of the pain we get for using other people's money. The right-of-way and utility relocation, that's where the actual, if we're going to do the underground utilities, that's where some of that work actually occurs. That always occurs ahead of the major road construction in the VDOT process. And so the private utilities will come in and put everything underground out of the way. And that'll occur sometime in October of 2022 to September of 2023. And then the main road construction will start in October of 2023 and last approximately a year into 2024. The other project that's going on in the area, because remember, this is just the streetscape and the corridor project. The other project that the city is doing is the Capitol Landing Road Bypass Road intersection improvements. And of course, that will now have to be potentially reconfigured due to the other economic development going on in the area. That'll start, is slated to start in September of 2021. Again, that's about a $2.5 million project on the intersection. And when I say start, that is start of the design process. So we still have to go through the road design, the whole process. That's about a 3-year total process. And that is a $2.5 million project or so, completely federal funds. So there's no local funds going into that one. In contrast to that, this Capitol Landing Road, just as a reminder, that's about $2 million in federal funds about 1.3 in state aid funds that we have to match with other state aids. And the other 3 million or so is city funds that basically are a match, as well as to cover the cost of the underground wiring, which the federal funds won't pay for, as well as some underground utility betterments that we need to do with the water main out there. And with that, we are now at the phase of the to ask for some questions.
Mr. Small, thank you. A lot of good information in there, obviously. But first, I think it's good to see the project kind of coming along. It's many people on staff can tell you we've been talking about Capitol Landing Road for
A long time.
and what we can do to help that area, and created the Northeast Triangle District and multiple studies, and I think we're right here at the pinnacle of an opportunity to get things really heading in the right direction. Now, 2024, some of those dates are still seemingly pushed back a little bit.
Some of that is, like I said, that's the cost. If we had $6 million of city money, we could start, very quickly and do it as fast as we did the Monticello project.
Right. Well, I think, taking advantage of the federal dollars that came in.
Exactly.
That will be part of this project, make the project happen, and so we'll have to adhere to that timeline. So that's perfectly understandable. Absent in some of these, in the survey, participants wouldn't have the knowledge, unless they had specific knowledge of how a road diet works in the other areas. And I think about the example of 2nd Street. What we've created there, I think, is actually helped traffic move more easily through that area.
It provides it's a safety improvement is what it provides, especially on 2nd Street. Before we had 4 lanes, 2 in each direction. And so if we had to have a pedestrian cross the road, they're playing the video game Frogger when you cross that road, because you've got 4 lanes that you're trying to watch out for as you try to go across. When you have the 3-lane section, you really only have 2. You're only looking at the lane coming at you in one direction, which also might have a bicycle. You're looking at the turn lane as you look in the other direction and look at the car on the other side of the road. So it's actually a much simpler, easier way. And if you have to, you can stop in the center where that center turn lane provides some, a little bit of protection. So it's much easier to cross the road.
Right. But inherently, and that's an absolutely important aspect of it, but we're not choking off traffic.
No.
By doing that. And I think that's an important part. When you think about the commercial aspect of it, I think oftentimes commercial people say, no, we want more roads, more traffic. But even in that example of a road diet, the traffic still can improve in terms of numbers, and pedestrian safety and all those things come along as a byproduct.
Right, and in the case of Capitol Landing Road, we have, I can't remember the exact number, but it's a very low number of volume of traffic right now. It's between 6,000 or 9,000, I can't remember the exact number, vehicles per day. And a 3-lane section, like we have over on 2nd Street, can carry 16,000 to 18,000 vehicles a day without a problem. And that's what it seems to be doing right now on 2nd Street.
I think Capitol Landing Road is one of the most highly trafficked traveled, and it's 18 is in the max back in the day, 18 maybe 20, as I recall. So I think the road diet would work there. So that's all. I don't have any other questions. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, Mr. Small. Appreciate the presentation, and more importantly, that you were able to adjust during the pandemic and at least have a virtual survey where people could participate and comment. And as you stated, I mean, as I went through the presentation earlier today, there wasn't a lot that was surprising there, as you referred to it, in the road projects as bling. I would want the same for.
That's right. Everybody wants the good stuff. Yeah.
So, but I was curious on the 47 respondents within the corridor limits. Do you know how many possible addresses there were, or what percentage that was?
I want to say it's around 81.
Okay.
Or more. I'd have to look, and I can look that up for you.
Yeah, I was just curious of what percentage of the respondents would, from within the corridor, that could have responded, what was that percentage that did respond? And then, when you talked about the breakdown of funds, obviously there's going to be some choices to be made if at some point because there's not enough funding to do
it all.
To do
That's
it all.
correct.
And so if you look at those important ones that you pointed out in one of your last slides, the underground wiring is going to be a significant.
That's a significant cost. And it could come down to, okay, do we want to do the underground wiring? If we do, then maybe we need to not do the multi-use path. In which case, what we'll have to do is when we get further along in the design, we get some direction from you on the scoping. One of the first things we have to do is refine our cost estimates. And so we'll come up with that cost estimate, and if it comes up to $7 or $8 million, we're going to have to then break it down, and we're going to bring it forth to you to decide. Tell us what you want, what you don't want.
And I know you had a timeline up there. What does all underground utilities add timeline to the project? I mean, how long does that typically?
It varies. We look at what happened over on 2nd Street when we did that underground wiring project, and that was about 6 to 8 months to do that. The other part of the overall underground wiring phase of the project is what we call the right-of-way phase, and it's actually right-of-way in utilities for most part. But that also is where the property acquisition has to come forth. And that could be easements or right-of-way, fee simple right-of-way acquisition. And that process, to meet all of those uniform codes, does require a lot of time.
Okay, that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Mr. Maslin?
Obviously, the survey, there were no budget constraints given, no cost trade-offs, making decisions.
That's correct.
If the budget's unlimited, this is what we do. When we come back to council for direction, is there any way you can sort of introduce that into the decision-making so that, we can actually focus on the trade-offs and where do we want the money to go?
I'd suggest we focus on, similar to the decision we gave to the citizens. We focus on what you really would like to see in the corridor. And then we can try to whittle down what we don't at that point, because it's really hard for us to determine. I could give you a cost for underground wiring right now, but what do you want to do if it's only partial underground wiring? What can you get if we only underground it along this corridor? That question is going to inevitably come up, but I need to kind of do a little more research on that. So it does take some time.
And maybe it's a ranking too. Mm-hmm. What are the priorities that we're seeing, and maybe weighing that against, the underground wiring portions, as you said. On-street parking, I remember the work session we had 3 or 4 years ago for Monticello, when people were asked what they think about the parallel parking there. And complaints were, well, it's going to stop traffic. And then the answer was, well, that's what we want to do. We want to slow down the traffic. Does that discussion come in here or not?
Not as much. It's in here. It's been more a matter of the question was just to ask, which do you prefer? And I think a lot of it is we don't have on-street parking now. And the existing business, part of the comments that we saw was the existing businesses don't have on-street parking now. They don't need it. They have their own parking lots. And I don't know if it's because they're just not thinking of the future on what it could be, but I do understand the reasoning behind it. And some of the property owners may be thinking, well, if you got to provide on-street parking, I got to give up property, and they may not like that. So there's a lot of trade-offs there that they may be thinking, but I can only go by what the comments provided.
The other thing, Mr. Maslin, is that we do get a lot of complaints. I won't say a lot, but we do get some complaints about speeding on Capitol Landing Road. And so, in the early stages of design years ago, we considered on-street parking as a traffic calming measure for that purpose. In Midtown Row, what we were talking about there, the strategy was slow vehicles down as they pass the business district. And certainly it could have that impact here if a business district sort of develops along the corridor, that the street frontage is closer to the street. But absent that, the utility of on-street parking is somewhat questionable. So it's probably less important here than it was at Midtown.
And I think also people could be thinking about safety issues too. Not having on-street parking is one less
Well,
safety issue.
and I will, playing on what Mr. Trivett said, on-street parking on Monticello Avenue was a specific request of the developer. And so that's one of the reasons why we kind of worked it in.
The other thing, I think, as we come together in terms of see the project more towards comprehensive options there, I think it'd be helpful, Drew, if we maybe get an update on economic development, our land banking, our real estate out there, and what's the plan and how does that come together in the overall project?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to also comment, this is sort of to both the Vice Mayor point and yours, Mr. Maslin. As we think about, as Aaron said, balancing the expense to the cost, or to the expense to the revenue that we have of the items that the surveyors have said they wanted, maybe it's less about deciding what we will and won't do and more about making sure that as we design it now, we leave room for some of those things that maybe we can't afford in this phase. So in the example that Aaron gave of a multi-use path, well, maybe we can't include that now in the same way that we would if we had all the money that we needed, but we make sure that we leave space for it in the right of way for a future project.
That's great. Barb?
Thank you again, Aaron. It's nice to see the results of the survey, particularly since I filled out the survey as one not living in the corridor and was interested to see how it all turned out. So I'm glad that the questions were asked about the underground wiring and the scope versus the cost, because that was a couple of my questions, and my preference too would be for us to sort of decide what we would like and feel is appropriate for the district, and then have the cost assigned and perhaps see what we could phase in or out in different times. And to me, some of the comments and the preferences or not sort of reflect what activity is going on there now or not. I mean, when you think about it, unless there's only a few things that one might want to go to Capitol Landing Road for at this point compared to other parts of the city. So I would think that some of the things like bike lanes and some of the street furniture comments might change and get a different viewpoint as the residents and see what the possibilities are a little bit more. And I was talking in our meeting this morning that as a bike rider, I am more in favor of the separate buffered lane or the multi-use pass. And I think, again, those who bike ride really can appreciate the safety concerns about having that separation from the cars. I recently rode my bike out on 2nd Street and over to the Sherwin-Williams paint store. And so once I passed the city limits, I lost some of that bike lane, but still being right next to the cars was a little anxious.
Precarious, yes.
Yeah. So, and we also talked this morning about, I was a little curious that particularly the residents liked all of the amenities that went with the street lighting and the furniture and the plants and all of that, but didn't really want a gateway. And I noticed your picture in here, it's sort of the arch. And so again, as we get into the design, providing some other alternates or preferences, perhaps something, welcome a little bit closer to the ground and not quite as big.
One of the other pictures that we could have provided, unfortunately, it was at a roundabout in Virginia Beach. And it was this gorgeous sculpture, but it was huge. And so it was kind of one of those things, this is probably not what we want to demonstrate as a possibility, even though I think some of the sculptures that are more on scale
Yes.
Would be very appropriate for that area.
Yeah, and as soon as you put a picture of a roundabout in there, then everyone would assume that you were planning on to including.
And that was the other reason.
Yeah, yeah. So, so anyway, those were just a few of my comments, and really excited for the next phase of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smalls, for going out to the public to have such a process where we had so many respondents. Very nice to call a couple of your friends in California and ask that they participate as well. But really, I know the original intention was to have these meetings in public, and so to have so many people respond, and so many too from that actual district, was really helpful in going over some of these, and will be as we sort of think over the next month about what works and what may not be liked by the community. One point that was brought up in the comments that we were reading, it was especially helpful when people, sort of self-proclaim themselves as living in that area or owning a business there. And one of those stuck out to me that said, how much might the city need to come into our easement if we go certain options over others? Maybe if we do, 4 lanes plus separated bike lanes plus sidewalks with the buffer, there may be a need. It sounds like there will be substantially less vision there, but is there, with the consensus around 3 lanes and potentially separated bike lanes, and need to consider moving it all into the property of others, or is it likely that with the area that's available, we could?
It depends on obviously it depends on the configuration on whether or not. We do have a fairly wide right-of-way out there. It gets a little constrained when we get down towards the south end of the project at Parkway Drive, but it's fairly wide in other spots. We also have spots where city owns property. Well, that property owner is really easy to deal with. So those are kind of just, a few spots like that really make it helpful along this project. But it does very much depend on, right now we have a 4-lane section with sidewalks that are at the back of curb. And our right-of-way is just a little bit beyond that in where we're at the narrowest section. And so if we did go with a 3-lane section with if you went with a protected bike lane, you actually can get it fairly close to the travel lane. And then went with just sidewalks on the sides instead of because you've got bicycle accommodation, and then you went with separated or buffered sidewalks, you may be able to fit that in the right of way.
Okay.
And that's where I would like to look at, is our intent is obviously to minimize our footprint. Mm-hmm. It helps us in a lot of different ways. It also keeps the bottom line of the budget within our budget.
Well, it looks like, thankfully, that there was consensus from both the broader community, but especially those that lived in that district, that the 3 lanes would work best for them. And I agree for bikers or people who are traveling in ulterior motives, having that separated area is a great asset. Now, if you're not using it as much, it might seem like a waste of space, but it does really contribute to how safe you could feel there. So that's good to hear that we would be able to accommodate. The modern versus colonial designs, the differences in lamps and benches, is there much a difference in price for those?
Not really.
Okay.
No, it really doesn't make a lot of difference, especially on the lighting side, because what you're seeing is just it's a look to the lighting, as opposed to the actual lamp itself. Almost all street lighting these days and the passenger lighting is all LED lights. Okay. And so they're going to give you about the same brightness, same lighting levels. It's just a matter of what does the fixture look like.
And then my final question, the idea for areas for a bus to pull off into as they pick up and drop off people. Good to know that in certain parts the city owns land, and potentially that could be a consideration for an area as it would extend the width of this redevelopment. Is there enough spots where it could be an area where we accommodate a bus pulling off and having that distance to pick up and drop off passengers?
Yes, we could easily accommodate multiple bus pullouts.
Okay.
Along the route. The trick is that particular road, we have buses that move in both directions. And so you not only have to have it on the right side, you have to have it on the left side to accommodate both sides. And that's where the current bus stops are, you could not, if we had to provide a bus pullout at every bus stop, we would have an extra lane for buses because they'd start to run together. And then, so that's where we're going to have to look. I think it's about siting and trying to use our best judgment as to this is the best location. And we'll work with WADA on figuring out, okay, this is the bus stop that gets the most use. That's the one where the bus is always stopping, because the bus keeps going if there's nobody standing there. And so if they're always stopping at the one to let off passengers, to load passengers, that's the key one where we need to have a bus pull out. And typically, that's also where you're seeing where the existing shelters are right now along the way.
Right. Well, those are my questions. Thank you again for such a well-sourced presentation.
Good. So again, thank you. So as I understand now, in June, you would like to bring this conversation back to us so that we can provide some more feedback. I know you'll probably be strategizing on how to best have that conversation so that we can give you the best input that we can. So
That's right.
curious to see how that works out. So I look forward to it, though.
Okay.
Good. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Takes us to item number B, presentation and discussion concerning the updated FY22 budget. Trivet.
Mark just walked over here to give me the clicker,
So
and
you have the
there's one there
clicker.
all the
So
time. So what we thought we'd do today is talk about the budget just a little bit more and sort of give you an update as to where we are at this moment. As you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the budget this year for obvious reasons. We wanted to start our presentation today with just sort of going over a little bit of the context of the current budget. And so what you can see here is on the left-hand side, we've got a lot of numbers there that represent losses in revenue associated with the COVID-19 and the mitigation strategies and its impact on some of our biggest revenue lines. The red numbers indicate the loss to the city government itself. So that's money that we would have access to spend. Below that line are additional revenues that we send on to the regional tourism entity, so we don't get to spend them. And so that's why they're not included in that red number. And then on the right-hand side, you have the actions that we've taken to overcome those losses. And so they span a couple different fiscal years. The one that I would like to point out is about midway down. You see general fund reserves, FY22. I think this is really the most important number on this screen because what it shows you is even with the city manager's proposed budget, regardless of which scenario we go with, there is a draw from the current reserve to balance the FY22 budget. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we talk about adopting one scenario or another. So the reason that's important is because we've spent a lot of time talking about forecasting revenues and to be conservative or be more aggressive, and hopefully we've hit a sweet spot with the presentation today. But what I would ask you to keep in mind is for those people that continue to say that we're being too conservative, two answers. Number one is that's traditionally how we have budgeted, and it's really been the secret to our financial success as a city. And then the second point is that in order for our numbers to be more conservative this go around, we would have to be conservative to the tune of $2.3 million for it really to start impacting this budget in a significant way. And that just seems incredibly unlikely. So I just want you to kind of keep that number in mind as we talk about this today. So then talking about what we've done since our last discussion, the last time we did talk about increasing revenues, and Ms. Dammer and I and her staff have gone back and looked at this, and we've squeezed the orange as much as we feel comfortable squeezing it. And so as you can see here, we did make some adjustments to some of those revenue lines based on the comments from the City Council. I did want to point out a couple of things, though, on this slide. Number one is our little balloon note that these are more aggressive assumptions. And the important thing to just keep in mind is the closer we get our projections to actual, the less room we have for error, the less the margin of error is. So it's important as we get closer and closer to actual performance of the economy, that the economy perform as predicted. And as we all know, that's not usually the case. In one line or another, it's going to be deficient. In another line, it may be a better economy than we had thought. So it's just important that we keep in mind that we're eroding away that margin of error as we get more aggressive in those assumptions. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is we've also talked a lot about this budget, and sort of around the edges of it are the things that contribute to the revenue. One of those things is parking. And as you know, the first draft of my budget did not include any parking revenue because we were still not quite sure what we were going to do as far as parking policy and how that might affect the revenue. So what we've done to overcome that is in this budget, we are showing additional revenue for parking now. And the number that's there, $450,000, is based on a simple step of matching our parking garage rate structure to the existing rate structure in Colonial Williamsburg. So that's $2 an hour with 2 hours of free parking. So that's sort of the base step that we've taken with this budget. The other thing that it does at that number is it allows us to make the investment, the larger investment that we've been talking about in terms of doing paid parking on street, adding some technology to make it more convenient. And at that point, this number still holds true. It may be a little bit low, but it's definitely not too high. So I think this gives us a good base point for parking revenues. So those are the big changes in the budget that we're showing you today. The other thing that we've done is the GFOA, which is the entity that grades our budget every year, has consistently said, City of Williamsburg, you really need to do a 5-year financial plan. And this is going to get a little bit confusing because many people who've paid attention to our budget know that we do a 5-year plan for the capital expenses and have for a long time. What we've not done is a 5-year financial plan for the operating expenses that are reflected in the general fund. And that's what the GFO has been asking us to do. Many localities have done this for several years now, so we're finally catching up. And we're pretty excited about it because its utility as a tool to determine fiscal health is really unmatched. I mean, if the city council and the community were looking for a place to go in the budget and say, okay, it looks like the city's doing well, this would be the place to go. So the way that we've constructed that estimate over the 5 years is by applying percentage growth to each of the key revenue lines, and that's what's reflected in this chart. What I want to point out about this is in FY23, we're using a growth percentage of 5.95. And if you look at other localities across the state that are doing similar 5-year projections, that's a pretty aggressive number. We just want you to know that going in, and then it starts to level out. The other thing that I would point out about our estimates is the growth predicted for expenditures is pretty conservative by comparison. So just keep in mind that's a fairly constrained growth in expenditures. So as we put these two 5-year plans together, the capital and the operating, there are two problems that arise. Number one, and we've talked about this a lot, I sent out 6,000 letters talking about it, the CIP imbalance. And we've been focused on how to fix that using a proposed tax rate increase. And then the second thing is something that we have talked about now for all the years that I've been in the city, and that is the declining revenue and the increasing expenses. You know, it's a common problem. It's certainly something that's been happening here. It's reflective of our current tourism. And so both of those things need to be considered as we look at those 5-year plans. So two scenarios that we have discussed so far, the city manager's original proposed budget of 0.68 cents on the real estate tax rate. That's the first row of charts. So we have the CIP on the left and the general fund on the right. Below that is the scenario that we talked about at the last council meeting, which was a 64-cent rate on the tax, on the real estate tax. And I hope what you can see pretty quickly is why the staff is advocating for 0.68 in our original budget. As we look at those 5-year projections, it doesn't take more than next year for it to quickly turn red, which is a negative number. So we're very quickly into a deficit position. Now, this is based on the improved revenue assumptions still. So just keep that in mind. The key thing about this is we can absolutely balance the budget this coming fiscal year. Obviously, we've shown you how we would do that. It relies heavily on using revenues in the reserve to get to that balance. But that's not to say we can't do that. The difficulty is that 5-year plan, that long-term horizon financially for the city. And, you know, the city of Williamsburg, one of our strengths financially has always been our ability to think about the impact of today's decision on tomorrow. And so that's what we're trying to show you here is this is less about this coming year's budget and more about the long-term stability. So a couple of things that we would point out is how would we balance the budget if the city council were to suggest a lower than 68-cent tax increase or 68-cent rate for the taxes. So I just wanted to show you this. We've showed it to you before. At the top you have the transfer from the general fund represented to the CIP, $1.4 million, and that's with the tax rate at 0.68. At 0.64, that transfer needs to be reduced to balance the budget. And it needs to be reduced by about $785,000 so that that transfer is about $51,000 in total. So the staff and I sat down and we looked at this and we came up with the list that you see in the middle of projects that are in the CIP that could either be eliminated or postponed to get to that balance. Now, these are just the projects that we would select and recommend. The City Council may have other ideas. There's certainly projects on here that you may feel particularly passionate about, and we would need to look for alternates. But this is our first pass at how would we balance the budget with that reduced revenue scenario. And so we just wanted you to see that list. Some other things that have been asked of us, these are two very common questions that we've gotten over the last few months. Number one is, how does the American Rescue Plan impact any of these scenarios? And then the second question is, the school and the county's revisions to the school system CIP, which have now been published, right? So let's start with the American Rescue Plan. A couple of things to point out here, and I wish there was more clarity today than there is. There are two unknowns. Number one is, how much money will the city of Williamsburg receive? And the second one is, what will the rules be on the money when we receive it? Now, just before this meeting, the Department of Treasury released, this is my favorite term for guidance, interim final guidance. I'm not sure how those two words work together, but that's what it's called. So that should give you some idea of the amount of clarity that's been provided. It's 150 pages thereabouts, so I didn't have time to read the whole thing before I came over. And it looks like it's fairly consistent with what we thought. We're going to be allowed to do things like revenue replacement. There are going to be restrictions, though, on applying it to certain infrastructure items, so we may have to be a little bit careful about how we apply that money into the CIP, et cetera. Still no clarity, though, on how much money we're going to receive. In fact, I think it's actually made it more confusing. We received some communications from VML that indicated the $2.9 million number, which is certainly not where we had hoped to be. But we also received communication from Congresswoman Luria's office that indicated we might get both the 2.9 number and the $13.5 million number to equal 16.4. So it's still not clear. Hopefully in the next few weeks, that will become more clear and we'll get the answer to that. Just so the public is able to understand this to the extent that I can explain it, the state of Virginia has a very different form of government. We use independent cities. We're the only state in the union that has independent cities. There are other independent cities in the country, but they're large metro areas and not impacted by this because of their population size. The state of Virginia, all of those cities that are independent now are sort of in unknown territory in terms of how much money they're going to get, because the Department of Treasury divided up their allocations of the funding into two categories. You're a county or you are a non-entitlement locality. There's a third category for the major metro areas, which obviously we're not. As definitions were applied to those terms, it became clear that the city meets both the definition of a county and the definition for non-entitlement. And so it's generated this question of how much money will we receive from this? And unfortunately, it's just still not known. So answering the question, hopefully a bit more succinctly, is what would we do with the money when we get it? So I asked Ms. Dameron and her staff to sort of think through that, knowing that the number could vary widely, as well as the rules. And essentially, we've put together this list for you to consider. Number one is, I showed you that chart of impact to the city, about $9.8 million. In other forecasts we've shown you, that number equals about $12.8 million. Certainly a high number and a big component of what we would try to restore using the ARP money when we get it. just trying to get the city back to a neutral playing field in terms of our budget, particularly in terms of how much we have had to use from reserves. So that would be our first strategy. Second strategy would be to repair the CIP to the extent that we can. We can't put back all of those projects. At this point, I think we're nearing $2 million in reductions from the CIP, and if you consider projects that didn't even get included in this year's budget proposal, it's even more than that. So we can't do all of it, but we could certainly look at some of those more critical projects and try to put them back in. Tourism fund relief, as you know, our COVID plan relied heavily on transferring money from the tourism fund to the general fund and to the CIP. We would go back and try to repair some of that. And then that would leave us with a very small amount that we could do additional business grants and relief in the community with. So as we move into the next part of this presentation and talk about what we're proposing today and what we would ask you to consider at Thursday's meeting, it's based on this ARP strategy, and it's also based on the city receiving the $13.5 million that we hope to receive as a non-entitlement community. As far as the school CIP question goes, essentially the school has a project and it's reflected in our CIP documents for a couple years out now, and it's reflected in our documents as school construction, an elementary school to be precise. The county would like to see that change focus and be about solving the pre-K demand and housing those students that are in pre-K inside the existing elementaries. The theory being that if we could pull those students out of the existing elementaries, it would create capacity at the elementary school level, as well as create some synergy and maybe even some cost savings in how we do pre-K. The school system has told us, though, that they think that the cost for either one of those are going to be similar. And we know that the timeline for that construction could be similar. So my suggestion to you would be that the change the county has made really doesn't impact our budget at all. The smart and prudent thing for us to do is to continue to plan for that expense at some point in the horizon of the 5-year plan, continue to build for a pay-as-you-go solution to that, so that when that cost does come along, whether it's an elementary school or a pre-K facility, we are prepared. So what do we really expect? Now, this slide offers the opportunity for people to be a little bit confused because what this shows you is what we think the eventual budget outcome will be. We think this reflects the budget of December. The reason I say that is because these numbers show you what the budget would look like, both in the CIP and in the general fund, after we receive the ARP funding. And that money being at the $13.5 million level, okay? At this point, it's not certain, but we still feel relatively confident that that's what we'll receive. So what we're showing you here is a budget with a 66-cent tax rate increase and having received the $13.5 million in ARP, and that money being distributed in the way that I just showed you on the previous slide. So what I'm saying is that when we go back and consider the difference between the 2.9 that we thought we were going to get this time last month and the 13.5 that we seem to qualify for now, it allows the city manager to reduce his expectation for the tax increase by 2 cents. And so we're going to present to you today the option of adopting a budget that includes a 66-cent real estate tax rate. Before we get to sort of that key slide of what we're recommending and the action that we need the City Council to take, there was a couple of requests from City Council to talk a little bit about the CIP, so the capital improvement plan. So we thought we'd just talk about that sort of at a higher level view. So this next few slides just run through the categories of capital spending in the next year and shows you some of the projects that we have budgeted. So I'm not going to read these off to you, I'll hit the highlights. Obviously, we just talked about the Capitol Landing Road intersection at $700,000. There's a component of that, of course, that's grant funded. Same thing with the Capitol Landing redesign. You can see the repaving amount up there at $794. Again, that includes some grant funding. I know that you're familiar with how we present the CIP. The first part of those pages of the budget shows you the grant revenues that are coming in from external sources. They're all dependent on these projects moving ahead. We have the new fire station, which represents bond spending. Same thing with the police station. And then we have some Parks and Rec projects over here on the right, as well as economic development, some or it's community and economic development, obviously a significant cost expense at the Blayton building that we can't avoid any longer of replacing the elevator. We've talked significantly about the take-home vehicle plan for the police department, as well as upgrading their existing equipment. Under general government, we have a couple of projects that are important to us. Number one is broadband development. We've talked about that considerably. This is really designed to help us increase competition in the city. Next is a lighting project at the Prince George parking garage. You know, one of the things that we frequently hear about people that won't park in the parking garage is they don't feel like it's safe. I certainly don't feel that way, but I can totally see how people find it to be dark and intimidating. So we would upgrade that lighting to improve it better, make it more visible inside the garage. The vehicle replacement plan, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. And then under contingency and debt service in the CIP, this is where we budget for our debt. So you can see that very clearly laid out. Then we have the school district and its impact on our capital improvement plan. As you know, the contract calls for us to pay about 10% of the cost of these projects. So these represent our cost in the coming year. And then this is the vehicle replacement plan. We very often get the question about what's included in replacement. So this shows you the breakdown, not by vehicle, but by the location of what's being replaced. So you have fire, public works, recreation, building inspection, and police. We do try to replace those, you know, on a pretty decent basis. That's explained there at the bottom. The reason for that is because as you replace vehicles, you're avoiding those maintenance items that are going to be very costly and repetitive. So we try to do that. Mr. Maslin asked me earlier today how we handle the disposal of the assets once we replace the fleet. And finance does a great job of putting those vehicles into surplus and auctioning them at the very earliest opportunity after they've been replaced in the fleet. So that brings us to needed actions as we move into Thursday's meeting and think about the budget moving forward. What we're prepared to do is ask you to adopt the city manager's proposed budget with two changes. The first one is adjust those base revenues, as we showed you at the very beginning, to be more aggressive. And number two, adjust the tax rate to 66 cents, anticipating the ARP money that will come. And so that's the next one. After we get the ARP, if you have adopted that 66-cent real estate tax rate, we will need to come back and adjust the budget through a budget amendment to accept the revenue and put it where it needs to go in the budget. So we'll get to have another conversation about how best to use that ARP funding when we get it. And then the final is adopt the recommended financial policy updates. Those items are on the agenda for Thursday's meeting. And certainly I think those will help in people understanding what our budget strategy is. At the bottom of this slide, you have what that means in terms of the budget that you would be adopting. You can see the CIP on the left and the general fund on the right. The red numbers are still included in the CIP because this budget is adopted without those ARP monies. And so once we get the ARP, those red numbers go away and we become balanced for the 5-year plan. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Trivett. I think, again, additional information is very helpful, certainly for the public who may not be as engaged in the nuances of the conversation and some of these issues. So, Vice Mayor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Trivett and Ms. Dameron and all the staff that has put together the proposed budget and made adjustments on request from City Council and come back with, you know, some increased revenues and a base budget of 66 cents. And also to all the community out there who's reached out to us either through phone calls or emails or personal conversations, because that's important as we get into the decision-making process of adopting this budget. You know, as with all the council members, it's been difficult for me as I've studied the budget, and I in no way question the numbers presented by Ms. Dameron or Mr. Trivett. I'm not a financial expert. But I do, you know, it's important that, to me, that we restore the city's financial health and we address the needs and look at the wants. But the other side of me is having empathy for the people in our community who are suffering financial crisis of their own. And then to add another significant tax increase to that, it's difficult, you know, and you know, I could sit here and say for me, for Pat Dent, I've been fortunate that I haven't seen the financial crisis that many in the community have from the impact of COVID. But we also have resources in the city to address that, where people in our community don't necessarily have the resources or the ability to address their financial crisis in the means that we do. So that's a big concern for me. And Mr. Trivets talked about the structural imbalance for a couple years now. So that's not a surprise to anybody. And then we obviously had the unanticipated revenue consequences, financial consequences suffered because of the pandemic. And so, again, I'm not questioning the numbers, but again, I'm approaching this as I would like to see us take it as a more gradual approach to recovery, allow our community to experience some recovery. The people in our community start to see the positive, hopefully in the near future, come out on the positive side of this pandemic and start to restore their own personal finances. So, you know, another thing that's come up in conversations is the GIO retreat and what the goals, initiatives, and outcomes that we've laid out as a council and as a community. Those are important to me as well. But the problem with the GIO when we have the retreat is we want Williamsburg to be the best it can be, which is great. The problem with that is we don't have any budget attached to those GIOs when we're laying them out. And I think it would be safe to say if the community knew that it was going to come with a significant tax increase, that they would support many of those GIOs right now based on, you know, a significant tax increase to make them happen. So it's great that we all want Williamsburg to be the best it can be. Again, I'm just taking this from, I would like to see us take a more gradual approach to recovery. And I'm okay with, I've looked over that list, gone through it, I've talked to Mr. Trivett, you know, that I would be comfortable with staff's recommendations, you know, of delaying some of these CIP projects. I don't want to get in the weeds on that because many of them have grants attached to them where we don't want to lose the grant opportunity. But I certainly think that, at least in my opinion, that there's some of those CIP projects that could be delayed. And I would ask that our city council colleagues at least consider a 64-cent tax, which is a 4-cent tax increase over a 6-cent tax increase. Again, giving our community an opportunity to recover. We take the gradual approach. I'm not questioning anybody on staff and their numbers. It's just that having empathy for the community right now weighs heavily on me to see people and talk to people that have experienced significant financial crisis, and then to add that, you know, a significant tax increase onto that. I just don't think it's the right time in the midst of a pandemic. And I would also ask, the mayor mentioned in the beginning that we could consider it, but that we consider moving the vote to June to allow another opportunity for the public to provide input. Maybe we have additional information on the ARP funds by then before we make a decision in May. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Maslin?
Yes, so thanks for comment on the parking. So I think the first budget proposal we saw, some of us were not really supporting taking a loss on parking and when we're raising real estate taxes. And I made the suggestion that 2 months ago, why don't we pay for that by going with 2 hours free parking in the parking structure, double the rate to $2, hopefully pay for it, but also get it the rate the same as CW is charging. And then later I found out that CW was offering 2-hour free parking in their parking lots. So I really support that being consistent in terms of how we're pricing, how we're going to communicate to the public, you know, after everything gets approved. So I think that's a good move. Can you go to the slide where you were showing the CIP funding and you had the moving objects in terms of those figures? So right there. So is that 51 correct, or should it be 510,000?
51's correct. That would be the transfer in 22 to the CIP fund.
So by reducing 4 cents, that's about 800,000, right? If we take 800,000 from 1.4 million, how do we get the 51,000?
It really boils down to, we had kept some in the general fund originally. We were transferring on 8 cents, I think 1.4, and this keeps us whole in the general fund, and we eliminate some projects. So in order to keep everything balanced, we end up transferring in 22 the 51,000. So it's not necessarily an apple to apple.
So the original budget, CIP, we were showing coming from the general fund.
About 6.6.
6.6, yeah. 6.6 of the 8-cent tax increase was going to fund the CIP. And the total we're getting in from the 8 cents is about 1.6 million?
The total is, from the 8 cent, we put 6.6 cents over at 1.4. I've done a lot of versions of this. So the total for 8 is about 1.6. You're right.
So about 1.6 million we're getting from real estate tax increase, just the rate. You know, we know we got more coming in because of assessments going up and more in the
Actually,
portfolio.
the increase that we get is really basically new construction,
Right.
not a lot in assessments.
So new construction, especially Midtown Row, right?
Right.
Coming on board.
Right.
So this 1.6 million from just increasing the rate, whereas we've got a potential for up to 16 million coming in from the federal government, that if we can wait another month and understand what the rules are and how that can be used to offset some of this 1.6 million from real estate tax increases.
I think that was on another slide where we assumed the 13 and a half.
But, you know, regardless of what the amount is that comes from the ARP, it would not be wise financially to try and balance the budget using that money because it's one-time revenue. So, you know, we're not going to get that again, very unlikely. So we'd be in the position of not only trying to balance what we did this year, but also whatever we need to do next year in next year's budget. So.
Well, yeah, given that argument, next year is a different year. Maybe people are better off financially. Maybe things will look a lot better. It might be easier to raise the tax next year, use the federal dollars to balance it this year, get us through this emergency.
All of the guidance and the Government Finance Officers Association has done a lot of educating, and their guidance has been to use for one-time, you know, capital projects, one-time expenditures, and not trying to close the cap on a reoccurring, because it'll make it harder in the future year to budget. I think a part of that, and I think what our other slide indicated, was maybe using some of it to replace the reserve that we've drawn down. Because really in all the versions that we haven't really come up yet with a plan on how we would replace that reserve.
And of course, a lot of decisions can be made once we know what the rules are. And I agree with the Vice Mayor that, you know, last meeting, we all agreed up here that we would not vote on the tax increase until June. And the reasons being were, number one, hopefully we would have more information in terms of revenue coming in. And number two, hopefully we would have more information on what the federal dollars are coming in and the guidelines for that. And I think those reasons are still valid to, you know, wait till we have more information in June before voting on the tax increase. Laura?
So I guess I take a little different approach to that and am concerned with the information we've received so far to date on the ARP, because I think we all thought a few weeks ago, oh, this is not really a slam dunk, but that we were fairly assured of the 13 point whatever it is, and that we would have some guidance by now. So I guess the question is, what if we don't know exactly how much we're getting in June? Then we're sort of in the position of we have to make decisions without that information. And a couple articles I read over the weekend makes me think that the federal government is going to take far longer to make the decisions on this money than had been originally hoped. So I'm not keen to delay that. And I also understand that regardless of what we do, either this month or June, we have to do something on the school budget. So we would have to make a special accounting for that. Correct, Mr. Trivett?
That's right.
So I look back at this as being a fairly long budget process. It seems that it's been longer than what we've had in previous years, and I really appreciate the staff's responses to all of our questions and reviewing numbers and relooking at the revenue and crunching the expenses. And I appreciate the fact that we held off on the budget to this month to allow for more public input. And I thought that because of that and because of the extra time that we might have more public show up today than we have. So I don't know whether extending it yet another month will energize different individuals to come forward. I think the biggest amount of public input I saw and recognized was after the letter that Mr. Trivett sent out in March, where we had a significant number of people respond, and at that point it was the 8 cents. We had a lot of things that were listed in the letter to provide the reasons for the tax increase, and from many people, I know a few in particular, that once they were really cognizant of some of the reasons, they were a little bit more appreciative of what the city was going through. And when I joined council in 2016, a lot of the budget discussions focused on the expense line trending close to or crossing the revenue line, which is what Mr. Trivett described as operating revenue and expense imbalance. And that was one of the reasons that council at that time created the TDF, was to broaden our tourism revenue outside of Colonial Williamsburg, which has experienced for many years decreased paid visitation. So some have suggested, well, let's wait a year for things to improve, but I advocated for the TDF because I felt that we needed to take action then, and I don't feel that waiting another year without doing some things is going to necessarily bring back a higher tourism. And I think the TDF has shown that it's a positive impact. And personally, I would like to be able to get to a point where we can start putting money back into the TDF and our tourism fund so that we can take action and be proactive and have additional projects. Because the more things that we have, like we've already started to see some of the, I should say, positive impact, then the more that we can expand those other taxes, the meals tax, which right now we are, I think, back to the 2019 meals tax or even more for what you're projecting for FY22. Is that correct, Ms. Dameron? Okay. And that's coming from 2019 and then dipping in 20 and then back here to 21. And I grant that there's a lot more people in town. It's great seeing all the people who were at Second Sunday yesterday and hopefully spending lots of money. So I appreciate, again, the taking additional revenues into account. And I am in favor of the 66 cents. And I guess I look at it a little differently. I'm not a finance person, so I look at 64 cents to 66 cents for a homeowner. I think if it's a $300,000 house, that would be an additional $5 a month. Is that correct? And if it's $600, then that would be $10 a month. And and for landlords who own properties and they pass that on to tenants, then that would be the same amount. Or if they're student tenants and there's 3 in a house, and that would be like at the most about $3 for $600,000 is how I look at it. But I balance that against sort of a marginal increase per month to close to $800,000 for our CIP projects. And I think one thing that we tend to be forgetting is that $800,000 for CIP projects is for FY22, and that doesn't take into account the FY21 projects that were delayed, just sort of sitting out there still to be done. So if we have all of the FY21 projects that have been delayed, and then we delay FY22, so we start off FY23 in a hole of about $2 million. And I never really understood CIP projects that much. I think, I always thought they were big, grandiose things, but I realize how many different aspects they fuel. And I keep going back to the 4th softball field at the Kiwanis Park. It had been on the CIP list for 20 years, and people said, oh, it's just a softball field, it's a want, it doesn't really impact. But I think we have recognized that sometimes those CIP projects really can benefit the city economically. If we had had that 4th softball field even 5 years ago, we would have been able to compete and probably draw some softball tournaments, would have had a positive economic impact to the city that we didn't have because of that. And I think about, the people in the Oaks who have wanted a sidewalk from their neighborhood down to College Landing for many years, and it's been delayed from FY22, and it'll probably go to FY23 and maybe FY24. And for some people would say, oh, that's a want, having a sidewalk from one neighborhood to another. But if you walk that street, you realize that that is really a public safety issue and a concern. And I think many of the other projects that have been delayed fall into categories that can really impact either economically or the well-being of our residents. And I also think about, what we're looking at for economic development and how can we draw talent to Williamsburg, and that young people today, they don't really look at what a job is necessarily, but they look at what the amenities are, what the neighborhoods, what the cities offer, and particularly with remote work, they can be at a place they really like and do a lot of jobs. And so I think that maintaining a healthy CIP and getting these projects done in the long run will have less reliance on real estate taxes and also help us as we try to attract that talent. And I do agree with the philosophy that the ARP funds are what they are, a one-time distribution, and I'm disappointed that we don't have more guidance from the federal government right now, disappointed but not surprised. And sort of the question is there any worry that we will not get that double-digit ARP amount?
Yes, absolutely. It's a concern. I'm still going to be optimistic that we're going to get the non-entitlement amount. I just think that the situation in Virginia in terms of the independent cities is so unique that, the guidance published today is broad brush national guidance, and it's not going to give us the instruction that we need. I think we just need to accept that. And I think over the next couple of months, we will get that answer. I mean, I think we talked about last time at the last meeting, the VML has sent a letter to the Treasury Department, as has the National League of Cities, urging them to include us as non-entitlement, if not include us in both amounts. So I think I'm still confident we'll be in that category.
But you made a comment there about a couple of months, and I know that we have seen July as a figure and also October as a figure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long it
Or
will
a
take
date.
them, you know, I don't know how long it will take them to steer their attention to the small number of municipalities compared to the whole nation that need this answer in Virginia. And so that's why I just don't want us to think that answer is going to be here in a couple of days. It may be, you know, we may get it tomorrow, but I don't want us to think that's going to be the outcome.
So, with that, I'm would push forward with passing the budget this month instead of having to separate out what the schools do. And I think that once we get the budget passed, then that provides us the opportunity to go forward with some of the other things that we've been talking about, including parking and other items that are there. I also agree that there will be something big coming for the schools. I mean, Pat and I are on the school liaison board committee, and I mean, all you have to do is drive around town and you see that there are more people here and there are more people coming, and with people come kids. And so if it's elementary or preschool or a high school expansion, I think that we need to be prepared to meet our contractual obligation. And so my preference would be to take care of the budget this month with the 66-cent tax increase.
I'm going to jump in with a few questions and then save comments for the end. Slide 8 in this slide deck here concerning some of the CIP projects. I was hoping to get a little bit more information from you, Drew, about a couple of these. Looking at them, if you're not someone who needs an ADA accessible path or is a regular fisherman, they maybe can seem like once over needs, but as I look at these, we've talked about our need for city areas to be accessible to people of mobility disablements. We've talked about how the actual fishing dock at Kiwanis Park would not be in use next year should it not be repaired this year, and that's a loss of a city asset. And then we've seen a few emails recently in which the PGPG, the Prince George Parking Garage, as we mentioned earlier, feels unsafe to some people who go in and park. So I see these as more needs over wants. Could you speak to a few others that may seem vaguer to folks who are just reading about them? For instance, broadband project being a benefit to economic development, to show how these are not necessarily things we talked about being really cool to have during the GIOs, but instead things that have been discussed and needed in Williamsburg for years.
Sure. We'll start with broadband. So, you know, that is sort of a nebulous title, broadband project, and if you know, it's difficult to understand. I hope everyone is now aware that we did launch a pilot program to look at providing the opportunity for competition to Cox's internet service in the city using Verizon Wireless. And we distributed some routers to Mark Barham's office, did a great job of handing those routers out. I think we still have a few available if somebody's watching at home and wants to be able to log in. You know, that's one solution. But in the end, it's a pilot program and it may not work. And it certainly may not work in every area of the city. The other thing is that there's always going to be a limitation of what we can accomplish in terms of speed in a 4G or even a 5G network environment as it compared to fiber to the user, right, which is the gold standard of broadband. Gigabit communities, I think that's still the marker that everybody wants to achieve. So we've got basically two paths. There's the path of the pilot program, which was grant funded and underway now, and then there's this broadband project. So this broadband project is designed more to advance our focus on fiber to the user while at the same time doing the pilot program. And as you said, that's important to economic development, because as Ms. DeWitt goes out and tries to attract the next big industry to Williamsburg, not that it's going to have smokestacks, but certainly it's going to have offices and cubicles, they need fast internet access. And in order to do that, they're going to need reliable fiber to the user to get there. And so I think it's really important that we continue to pursue both options. The money that's in the budget for this project is a very small number. And it's really just a first bite, if that's accurate, at the apple of this. It's designed to give us the money that we need to do a study to determine where we would need to put fiber in the ground to overcome that. I think that if Mr. Barham wants to, if you're all are interested in hearing from him today, he can talk about 2 companies that have contacted us who are interested in being in the market and helping us overcome this challenge. And so that money that was allocated to the broadband project would help us facilitate some of those initial investments to make it more attractive for them. So that's really a very important project. I know all of you have received emails about the lack of competition, and so anything we can do to try and overcome that hurdle, we should do. You know, I could pick out any number of projects to talk about, and certainly there's a whole host of projects on here that are parks and recreation, and a lot of people would consider parks and recreation investments as investing in wants and not needs, unless you're the person that uses that facility, right? And then it's a need, right? So rather than do that, let me just say that when you're considering a budget that is the size of ours, which is certainly not a huge budget by comparison to other localities in the state, but over $60 million. Anytime there's an increase in revenue proposed, it's very easy to go through $60 million worth of expenses and identify the things in it that you don't think are important and attach those to the increase. Well, if we just cut out this thing, and this thing, we can balance this budget without the increase. And, you know, I think, as I say, that's very easy to do, but the reality is the letter that we sent out that described the need for the increase is really why we're doing this. It's not necessarily about any one particular project. It's about the long-term health of the city. And that's why those red numbers on that other slide are so important, that show you the difference between the 2 tax scenarios right there. I mean, this is really a decision that's going to help us position the city for FY 2026. And so I really want us to be careful about not making the wrong step here.
Right. Well, I think it's been mentioned too that some projects that might seem like a want, for instance, the softball field, which isn't included here because it has been funded, have been talked about for years and then will assist us for years to recruit. Other tournaments, similarly and more residentially, certain neighborhoods have been promised, you know, a sidewalk eventually, paving eventually, and that's been pushed off, but could very well be funded this year. Slide 5, the figure that you quote, 5.95%. Projection for a revenue increase. It was touched on earlier how we are getting to almost FY 2019 numbers, so a total rebound, you might say, for FY 2022. And you mentioned that other Virginia localities are more around the 2 to 3% revenue increase. Does that differ at all from localities that are more reliant on tourism? Because that number, as I've come to understand it, really does show exactly how aggressive we are being with some of the forecasting in this budget.
Sure. So Alice actually put together our 5-year plan, and so she can talk about which communities she looked at, but she did a pretty decent sample of localities across the state here in the region to see how they do their 5-year plan. So Alice, do you want to say anything?
Yes. We looked at a lot of different cities, but what we tried to do is concentrate on those cities that did have a lot of tourism. Particularly Virginia Beach puts together a book every year on a 5-year forecast, and they were doing very conservative, especially with their real estate, but their hotel and meals and the consumer-driven type taxes, they were being very conservative of 1 or 2%. And the other thing we looked at is the Congressional Budget Office came out with numbers, and their growth is 6% for next year, but then 1 or 2% for the rest of the 5 years. So we were trying to be very aggressive in terms of our real estate and making sure that we came back to FY23 numbers, came back to the FY19 numbers for some of our hotel and restaurants, but not trying to be overly aggressive, but I think when we compared it to the other cities, they were very conservative when they were doing their Richmond, Virginia Beach, some of the cities that, we also took a look at some of the cities like Delray Beach and Charleston and how they did their forecasting, because they were obviously more tourist. And so we were being a little bit more optimistic, maybe that's a better word than aggressive, but hopefully looking at what the CBO said and what some of the other cities were doing, I thought we were in line, but maybe a little bit more optimistic than some of the other cities.
And so I think the message there is that these are numbers we're comfortable with, but it's on the upper end, of comfort. And I think that you've heard us say it a million times. Hopefully you just heard what Alice said about the other localities. The prudent budget strategy is to be conservative and then be surprised, because it's so much easier to go that way than it is to try and recover revenue that you never collected.
Well, thank you, Alice, for your assistance in putting together that 5-year plan. That does help. I think it shows how hard we are trying to work to make this budget work. My last question is, it's been discussed, are we considering the budget in May on Thursday or in June's meeting? Has there been any indication that we may know more about ARP within the month, or is it likely, as mentioned, going to be an early time frame of July and late of October?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we got the guidance today, so we now have rules that we can digest more fully in the coming days, and that will answer that question. But, Barbara may have a different opinion. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get a solid answer on how much money we're going to receive. I did try to dig into the stuff that was published today, to see if I could get any kind of certainty. And what I found is VML sent out communications to all of us. You all probably received it. And the only thing that they attached was the county allocation amount, and that's the 2.9. And so if you just went by that, you would think that's all we're going to get. Congresswoman Luria's office sent us the same thing and said Williamsburg's allocation is 2.9. But then the bottom line of that email says some localities will receive funds both as a city and a county. I just think it's still very, very unclear. When I dug through the Treasury website to try and get to the allocations for the non-entitlement cities, they didn't even publish that list as individual cities like they did with the county allocations. What they did was they published it based on states, how much each state is going to get for non-entitlement cities. So I think it's still very uncertain. Will we know tomorrow? Will we know next week? I can't say. I feel like, given the fact that this is an issue that is limited in scope to the state of Virginia, it's probably going to take us a little bit to get that answer.
All right, well, here's kind of where I am on this conversation, and I'll try to be brief and save the majority of my comments for Thursday. Vice Mayor Dent, I think you summed it up well, that none of us are pleased to be in the position now to, in a difficult economic time, also be considering needing to raise the Williamsburg property, the real estate tax rate. But it was also mentioned, considering the long-term wants of the city in some of our GIO discussions with what we are funding right now. And per what we just went through and have heard over the last few months, I see some of the things that we're funding now with the 6-cent raise to 66 cents to be real needs for the community, where we might actually lose out on assets should we push those back a year, rather than just say, well, we can wait one more year to do them. For instance, one of the things that's mentioned in our more optimistic budget is seeing a raise in how much our revenue is from parking. But if we then don't fund the better lighting in Prince George parking garage, what happens if we see some of those numbers decrease because we didn't go ahead with that funding? Second, on the topic of when is the best time to do this, I think also trying to be good stewards of public trust is one of the more 30,000-foot things that we try to do on council. And if we were in a position now to instead say, let's raise to 64 cents, being a 4-cent raise, it was already mentioned that that's a minimal raise between 64 and 60 cents, which is really the decision here. Does that put us then next year in a decision of, do we have to bump it up again? And in the course of 2 years, raise the real estate tax rate twice on our citizens, rather than being in a better economic position so that we can then say, well, potentially are we in the option to lower it instead of raising it twice in 2 years? So to the 66 cents, which is proposed today, I think that allows, to Councilwoman Ramsey's point, a greater and quicker replenishment of things like the TDF, which will hopefully make us achieve that optimistic 5.95% increase revenue that we are projecting for FY 2023. And then it'll also help us do a quicker addressing of city services, like making sure that we have assets for people who want to travel to Williamsburg to fish, or we are providing good places to park in the city by addressing some of those needs right now. And finally, we were discussing last month potentially postponing this debate until June, which I think was a fine consideration then, and is even a fine one now. I'm glad that we're able to be back in person today and that we will be on Thursday as well. But two things have made me think that maybe May is a better decision to do that. The first being that we will, whether we vote Thursday or in June, likely have to vote, well, we will have to vote on providing the funding for school CIP projects, which is already a substantial amount that we would be using some of the assessed raise for. And the second is that it doesn't seem that we will have a greater understanding of the ARP in June than we do now. And so I think we have the fine and almost exciting understanding that it's going to be almost 10 million more than we were projecting as of last month. It would be better for us to move forward with the budget now so that we can move ahead with some of the projects that we are getting towards, and potentially and hopefully be in a position sooner rather than later where we could lower that tax rate again, which I think is the intention of council. So that is my conclusion of my comments, and I will support a vote on Thursday for the budget.
Well, thank you, each of you. I think you all have made some great observations, some great points on both sides of the issue. And I really don't see that we're taking any real substantive difference in our positions in terms of what we want to do for the community, in terms of what's best. It's just a really, I think, an issue of timing which separates the argument here. So I applaud you all for taking the time to be diligent and thoughtful through this process. You know, and Councilman Rogers just spoke to it in terms of whether we vote in May or June. I think the large part of that was we wanted to have this opportunity in May to hear some public input. And so I think we're allowing for that to happen. And so I would be prepared to have a vote on Thursday if there seems to be a consensus on where we need to be. You know, for me, it's you know, I've been here at the dais now 11 years, honored to do so. And over these years, and even before that, before I was on council, you know, we have been challenged with our revenue declining and not keeping up with our expenses. And the artificial way that we, in the past, have supported our capital improvement plans with budget surplus funds, we're just not able to do that anymore, which is what's put us in this predicament today. So this, to me, goes well beyond the effect of COVID in terms of the need for the revenue. Now, the effect of COVID does have an impact on the community, which Vice Mayor Dent spoke to eloquently, and I am very sympathetic to that. You know, and I know that we are a generous community, and you know, we will, if there is a 6-cent raise versus a 4-cent, you know, if that presents a challenge, I'm sure we can get our hands around how do we grapple with that. You know, every dollar is important to people. You know, for some, the additional $70 a year that it would cost, you know, difference between 64 cent and 66 cent on an average home of about 350. You know, it's manageable, I think, for a lot of folks, and some it may not be, and we can work through that. I would like to believe we can. So I think if we're really wanting to, you know, as our mission statement was changed this year to, you know, courageously lead an innovating modern city, we've got to stay on top of these standards that our residents have set for us. To make sure that we have accessibility to our parks, make sure that they're in good condition, make sure that our streetscapes are well kept, make sure that our staff is, you know, properly motivated and rewarded for their efforts so that they deliver the service that our community has grown to expect. I just believe, and if we stumble on that, it's going to be harder for us to recover. And you know, again, I think back to, you the paying class issue that we dealt with several years ago, which, cost us a lot of money because we had fallen behind on what we were paying our employees. And that was a struggle for all of us, but more so for the employees. And I think that's just an example of falling behind on doing some of these things that we need. So I'm prepared to move forward with 66 cents on Thursday, if that's the will of council then. So with that said, sure. Yeah, so again, at Thursday's meeting, there will be more opportunities for public participation. Certainly my phone has not been turned off. My emails still come in, and I'd be happy to have a discussion with folks. And, to that, when I walk my little dogs in the neighborhood, the overwhelming sense that I get from folks is they are comfortable with a tax increase. And I recognize, some people, good friends of mine, are opposed to this, and I don't take that lightly. But I think that's why we get the big bucks, is to be challenged with these questions. Because ultimately, it's our responsibility to provide a city in which everybody feels like they want to be in. And I think we need to do that by shoring up our capital reserve funds, and shoring up our revenue stream. Okay, so come see us between now and Thursday to the public. Anything else on that, Mr. Trivett?
No, sir, thank you.
Okay, so that takes us to item 5, City Council Communications. Anything? All right, schedule meetings, Mr. Trivett?
Sure. So today, it's actually over as of 5 minutes ago, but we did have the building products showcase for the ARB outside of the Stryker Center. Hopefully everybody got a chance to come by and see those products and provide some comments to the staff. We will have the regular meeting of City Council on Thursday. Business Roundtable is on May the 11th, featuring Stacy Martin, who is the Senior Destination Development Specialist for the Virginia Tourism Corporation. That's at noon, and you can tune in virtually if you'd like. And then Planning Commission on May the 19th.
And EDA meeting on the 12th.
Yes, the EDA will meet on the 12th.
He always forgets that.
I think I get it wrapped up in the Business Roundtable. So.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that takes us to the next open forum, which is again the opportunity for anybody in the audience to come forward. Seeing none, I will close the open forum. I believe Mr. Dent, or Vice Mayor Dent, we have an item for closed session.
We do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye. Okay, so we will go into closed session, and then we'll come back to this room for conclusion of the meeting.